Hello, and welcome to today's call. I'm Janice Paraket with Represent Us. We're going to give folks just a few minutes to log in and get settled, and then we'll get started. Just a few minutes. For everyone who's just joined, I'm Janice Paraket with Represent Us, and we're going to give folks just one more minute so everyone can join. We have a lot of people joining today. Thank you. All right, let's get started. Again, I am Janice Paraket. I am the VP of Development for Represent Us. Thank you so much for joining us today. I want to acknowledge and thank all of our supporters and volunteers who are on this call. There are so many of you. I'm seeing all your names. I want to make sure you all know how much we appreciate your leadership and your continued support. We could not do this work without you. All right, let's dive in. I'm joined today by my colleagues, two of the smartest people I've ever worked with, my co-founder and CEO, Josh Silver, and our VP of Policy and Campaigns, Alex Kaplan. Josh and Alex, how are you guys today?
Doing well, thank you. It's good to be here.
Great. Alex?
He's muted. You would think we knew how to use Zoom by now, Janice, but we only use it 40 times a day.
Some of us are still learning. I'm doing great. It is wonderful to see you all. Thank you for joining.
That's great. So folks, before we get started, I just want to walk through our logistics. All right, so we've got a chat box open. Please use it to interact with each other and us. We will be monitoring this. For the Q&A portion, please put your questions in the chat box. We will be collating all of these questions. All right, and so at Represent Us, we normally start with an icebreaker. And the way we'd like to do this is for all of you to participate with us at this moment. So here is our icebreaker. What is the thing that is giving you hope right now for American democracy? All right, who do I pick here? Josh, let's start with you.
I'll go first. I have to say, it's kind of a bittersweet thing, which is that I think the experience our country has had over the past days, months, years has finally shined this sort of unavoidable light on how broken our political system is, and that what we've been saying for years is actually true, that we better fix this or else. And I think we have millions and millions of people who get that now who did not used to.
Alex, what about you?
I have two things, Janice. The first is voter participation. It is the cornerstone of our democracy, and this year looks to be clearly a blockbuster. We want everyone to participate, no matter their politics. We want people to feel like democracy works, and I think we're really seeing that this year And the combo to that is the fact that this process is working as planned. Yes, it's taking a few more days than a lot of people like, but people started to really understand that because of COVID, because of how different 2020 is. We're seeing fringe protests, we're seeing some of disinformation online that's predictable, but largely this is working exactly as it's planned. The networks have done their job. It's thanks to so many people's work, but it's also thanks to the American people participating and being patient.
Oh, boy, is that well said. So, folks, I have to agree with Alex. I am not from this country, and I remember registering, first becoming a citizen, and then voting in my first elections. And the turnout has been incredible. And I'm seeing some of the things that folks are saying here. Charles just said, love the turnout numbers. Christopher, the collective consciousness of America has awoken. Yes, so many people coming in. Well, so I just want to remind folks that we are right now recording this call. So if you, we will be sending it out so that you can pass it along to your friends. And we've got a lot to cover, so I'm going to move on. So first, we're going to cover the current status of the elections, the possible scenarios that can happen still, and then what's ahead for the reform movement. So without further ado, I'm turning it over to Josh Silver. Josh, go ahead.
Thank you, Janice. I'm going to share my screen where you will first see my daughters, and then soon I will get my keynote up. So what we're going to do is we're going to walk y'all through first the status of the election, and then we're going to talk about what's ahead for reform. We're going to start with the state of play in the states, and Alex is going to walk you through the vote count in each state because my 52-year-old self has still not figured out how to get to my notes while this keynote deck is up right here. So Alex, just walk folks through the horse race right now as of 12:08.
Yeah, it is changing every minute, as I'm sure a lot of you know, but major battleground states are outstanding. Pennsylvania, North Carolina, Georgia, Nevada, and Arizona to a certain extent as well. As I'm sure you know, two networks, AP and Fox, called Arizona. Others have not yet called it. Results are rolling in by the minute. All expectations are by these 5 states, we're going to have a lot more information in the next few hours. Arizona is releasing information. There's going to have a big batch around 9 p.m. Eastern today. In Nevada, noon, we're crossing that threshold now. It's not going to be final, but more information is rolling in and probably is as I'm speaking. Pennsylvania has continued to roll in. The Pennsylvania Secretary of State doesn't expect to have finals until Friday tomorrow, but they're updating every hour basically. And Georgia, the Republican Secretary of State, Brad Raffensperger, announced that he expects to be done with his full final count by noon or sometime midday today Eastern. North Carolina is still rolling in. They're going to be accepting ballots that were postmarked by election day for quite a while now at agreement of the Republicans and Democrats there on the county elections board. So while North Carolina is trending towards Trump, that may be actually the last one that gets called. We know that there are recount attempts in Wisconsin. We're going to talk a little bit more about the legal, but all told, the takeaway here is that the next few hours, we're going to know a lot more about key battlegrounds, Georgia, Nevada, Arizona, and possibly Pennsylvania as well.
Thanks, Alex. And as you know, if you've been paying any attention, it's Biden's to lose at this point. He's still heavily favored to win this, but it did overnight, it did change. And especially because he lost some of his lead in Arizona and it did tighten. One piece of good news, despite the fears of violence that we all shared, Election Day and thereafter has proceeded relatively smoothly. I think a credit is due to the press. I think the media has done a relatively good job of encouraging calm, waiting before projecting winners much longer than they normally would and being more cautious in that way. And also ignoring the president when he makes false claims of election victory. It was interesting to see that sort of land with a thud. One of the exceptions, of course, is the primetime Fox News hosts, the ones like the Laura Ingraham, Tucker Carlson, Sean Hannity, who really are stirring it up now in terms of questioning the legitimacy of US elections. One thing to also note, there has been some some upset in the streets. We saw the National Guard activated after widespread violence in Portland, Oregon. In New York City, we saw arrests of about 50 protesters last night. And in Detroit and Phoenix, we saw something just like it's almost like from the satirical The Onion. There were angry Trump supporters in Detroit calling on election officials to stop counting the votes. And you had armed Trump supporters in Phoenix, Arizona, demanding that vote counting continue. So it's been a bizarre whiplash of a 24 hours. And there are some fundamental questions that still are outstanding. Assuming Biden wins, what will Trump do? What will be the status of the lawsuits that Alex is going to talk about in a moment? What is the Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell going to do? And what is going to happen in the streets? But one thing we know is that we need to keep calm. It's critical that people keep pushing this message. We have intentionally not called on our members to go into the streets. We don't think that that would advantage anybody. And so for the moment, that's where things are. And now I'm going to go back over to Alex to talk about the legal scenarios. Alex?
Great. So we will take just a minute to recap the fast-moving legal situation, the Trump campaign's attempts. Largely, the lawsuit attempts in the past 48 hours are pretty frivolous. You can generally think of this as spaghetti at the wall, and that's not uncommon. He's generally trying to stop counting where he's losing ground and to keep counting going when he thinks he can gain ground. And every presidential campaign considers doing these types of things because they want to win. A lot of it is not going to be very successful, we think, but that's how the courts work. Where it will matter is if in final margins in places like Georgia, PA, Arizona, and Nevada could be as slim or as slimmer as they are right now in Wisconsin, where it's 30,000 votes and that will allow a recount. Usually recounts do not swing elections at all anywhere close to 30,000 votes. They swing them close to 300 votes. But it also gives more opportunity to invalidate ballots. And remember, the attempt to invalidate ballots is pretty par for the course by both sides, unfortunately. The key here is that unlike in 2000, when it was all about just one state, Florida, and there were 500 votes, that was close enough for there to be a recount, ballot invalidation, and it could all hinge on that. Because Biden is so close to 270, the Trump campaign needs to be able to be successful in a lot of these lawsuits, throw out a lot of ballots, do recounts in more than just Wisconsin. And that's a pretty tall order, especially given the way some of these states are trending. In addition, really smart GOP lawyers, both inside the Trump team and outside, have really brushed aside the idea that Trump has a quick pathway to the Supreme Court saving him. But just remember, it's not over till it's over. There's a possibility of long recounts and litigation in battlegrounds, but it's looking unlikelier by the hour. One thing to say is that Represent Us, we've been planning for the past 2 months a pretty extensive state legislative lobbying program in Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Michigan, Arizona, places like that, to set up a firewall against what you may have read about a while ago about state legislatures taking matters into their own hands and appointing alternate slates of electors, those nightmare scenarios. It does not look like we're going to need to activate that. We have a lot of great people across the aisle, bipartisan, GOP and Democrat, that don't want to see democracy get to that point. But these things are in place in case that happens. We should generally be seeing things resolved on the legal side tonight, tomorrow, over the next few days. But again, it could continue and we will know more today and tomorrow. Now, Josh, I'm going to go talk about the Senate next, unless you'd like to pause there.
No, go ahead, Alex.
Great. So a quick update on the US Senate. Everyone's focused on the presidential, understandably, but the Senate really matters for what type of governance and opportunities this country is going to have in the next few years to handle things like COVID, democracy reform. And Josh is putting up the Senate map right now from the New York Times. So as you probably know, it's looking very likely the Republicans currently have 48 seats and Democrats have 48. It's looking very likely that North Carolina there is going to be won by the Republican Tom Tillis. That would put Republicans at 49. And down in the bottom left-hand corner, Dan Sullivan, the Republican incumbent, is likely to win Alaska. Democrats flipped Colorado and Arizona. Governor Hickenlooper won the Senate race there, and Mark Kelly won the Senate race. but also Republicans defeated incumbent Democrat Doug Jones in Alabama. The ultimate math here is that what we're looking at likely is by the end of today, 50 Republican seats and 48 Democratic seats. Definitely the Georgia special race. There are two races in Georgia, as I'm sure you know. The Georgia special race in the very bottom hand corner is going to a runoff between incumbent Loeffler and Democratic challenger Warnock, who's the pastor at MLK's church in Atlanta. That runoff will be on January 5th. It's also looking very likely, and our research team is telling me right now, that the other Senate race in Georgia, incumbent Senator Perdue versus John Ossoff, is also likely to head to the same January 5th runoff, because it looks like Perdue is going to get under 50%. And if you don't get over 50% in Georgia in these races, in these special races, you go to a runoff. The takeaway there is that there will be an opportunity on January 5th for Democrats to capture both of those seats, or Republicans to keep them in their corner. And so the point and the takeaway is to expect a potential major campaign over the next 2 months. And it really could be a blockbuster in terms of money spent and attention. We could see high energy surrogates like the Obamas, Stacey Abrams, Oprah, and Beyonce descending on Georgia, and the Republican Party doing the same, because control over the Senate could really come down to this. And if Biden wins and Vice President Harris is vice president and it's 50-50 split, then Harris will cast the tie-breaking votes and Democrats will have a razor-thin majority in the Senate. So this matters because Democrats have an ambitious package and plans around COVID, green jobs, climate, racial justice. They're unlikely to do so without a Senate majority. But it also matters because of what's ahead for the road ahead for democracy reform. And that's what we're going to talk about next for our final segment. So I'll go back to you, Josh.
Thanks, Alex. So before I jump into what happened this year, and it wasn't a whole lot because of the COVID crisis, it really took a big bite out of reform efforts, especially because of a lot of ballot initiatives under this way. Like you, I was sort of like stress reading news last night and came across this article about how Australia, remarkably, has now 0 local coronavirus cases for the first time since June. And one thing that struck me was the top part of this just talks about all the different things they did that we did, that the United States and Europe did not, particularly the United States. But then it said this: perhaps most importantly, though, leaders from across the ideological spectrum convinced Australians to take the pandemic seriously early on and prepared them to give up civil liberties they'd never lost before, even during 2 world wars. And it strikes me because the reason you guys are all here with us is that you have a connection to Represent Us. And Represent Us is about getting at those systemic, structural, foundational causes of the polarization, extremism, corruption that define US governance, that make us in this state of gridlock and extremism, special interest capture, that is making getting subpar people elected and making our politicians behave badly. And I just want to kind of underscore that, like, you don't have to read a book and just sort of in a cerebral way theorize about this. You're seeing it in real time, looking around the world and seeing what governance can be if done better than what we have. As I mentioned, the coronavirus put a wrench in the works, but we did manage to have some important victories. We ended or passed a good anti-gerrymandering law by ballot in Virginia. Oregon passed a campaign finance reform measure. We saw that ranked choice voting passed at the ballot in Albany, California, Eureka, California, Boulder, Colorado. Great local groups just crushed it there. We saw 2 losses. The most heartbreaking was in my state, Massachusetts, where ranked choice voting lost by the slightest of margins. Why? Because ranked choice voting is complicated when you look at it described by a technocrat on a ballot. And if you learn about it, you want it. And if you just read what's on the ballot, it can be confusing. That happened. Missouri and a pro-gerrymandering law passed, if you will, by repealing an anti-gerrymandering law that had been on the ballot. We saw 2 other victories in Minnesota, Bloomington and Minnetonka, for ranked choice voting. So some glimmers of hope, but certainly nothing like the massive swath of reforms that happened in a non-COVID year in 2016 and in 2018. Alex? I think you might be muted.
Usually this is the switch. Usually I'm better at this than you are, Josh.
I know. Yeah,
okay.
Than me too.
So we'll take a minute here to talk about the real big pathway for reform, both in the immediate term and in the long term. So as you probably know, as we were just talking about, Democrats had an ambitious agenda, assuming they were going to take the Senate, which was what a lot of the polling thought. The polling was off. And they had the agenda I just discussed, but they also had a big focus that's commonly called House Resolution 1, a democracy reform agenda that would address some of the most broken pieces of democracy at the federal level: anti-gerrymandering, money in politics, dark money disclosure, voting rights. And they've been the party right now that's been supporting that. We want to support anyone that does that, but it was a pretty big deal that the Democrats were getting pretty close to the opportunity to pass HR 1 in this incredible package. Now, the significant support from voters from across the aisle for these types of reforms, Democrats, Republicans, and independents alike, when you poll them every time, it's the GOP leadership that has been blocking this for years. As I just said a minute ago, if Democrats can win those 2 Georgia Senate seats on January 5th, it does open this possibility back up for federal reform. Now, that's a pretty razor thin margin. Moderates like Joe Manchin and others would have to stick with it, but it's still possible things could happen. But it's unlikely that the Democrats are going to win both these Senate seats. But I also want to say it doesn't mean that federal reform is dead in the near term, and I'm going to talk about that. It doesn't mean 2022 can't produce that margin for the Democrats or Republicans who want to be pro-reform and make 2023 a big reform year. In fact, 2022 is another one of these bad maps for Republicans. They're defending a lot more seats in 2022. 2024 is the bad map for the Democrats. But remember, if politics has taught us anything, it's that anything can happen at all times. But more likely what we need to do right now is shift our sights and adjust our framework. And in this field of politics, and specifically in democracy reform, pro-voter work, adaptation is always essential to success. So Josh and I are going to put forward a framework to think a little bit about reform a little bit differently post-2020. We've just had 24 hours, 48 hours of the dust settling. It's going to take some weeks here. But all told, the last 4 years have demonstrated that there is an immediate and enormous need to fix many, many issues. But some of the most prominent ones are about preventing authoritarians or wannabe dictators from gaining power and thwarting them from doing what they want to do if they are able to gain some or a lot of power. Preventing and thwarting. So we're going to talk about those in turn. We're actually going to start with the idea of thwarting. And we're going to be talking about and proposing with partners an anti-authoritarian act or something like that that addresses 3 key issues. And I'm going to talk about 3 in thwart and 3 in prevent. The big major things that Americans across the spectrum agree is that presidential candidates should not have conflicts of interest around tax returns, nepotism, business interests, and even the blending of their White House office and the campaign that we've been seeing recently. That's number 1. The second is that entities like the FBI and the DOJ and the NSA should not be used ever for political purposes. That is a hallmark of dictatorship. And the third big one is obstruction of justice. The president should not be able to obstruct justice, and that especially has to do with potential runaway pardon power that we may be seeing in the next few weeks. What does it look like to pardon people in a way to obstruct justice, perhaps pardon yourself? So the question probably on your mind is, could we get this passed, given the current Senate likelihood? And we actually think we could. We think there's a big opportunity here. There are at least 3 Republican moderates in the US Senate. You've heard a lot about them. Romney, Susan Collins just won again, Lisa Murkowski in Alaska. They're going to be reaching the end of their careers. Susan Collins just won her 5th term. What will be their legacy? We believe that they're going to be interested in helping restore civility and trust and moderation to our election process that Americans across the spectrum want to see. And they could be joined by Democratic senators who are close to President Biden or President-elect Biden. Like Chris Coons, we could see a gang of 6 fight to pass a powerful suite of reforms supported by broad swath of Americans who want to de-escalate politics. They want to build trust in nonpartisan work, and they want to make sure, this is really key for someone like Biden or Trump or anyone coming in the future, that they cannot manipulate the power of the presidency. It's also important to know that a Biden administration or any future administration can restore important norms and rules through executive orders and even rules inside the DOJ that can make a lot of difference, even if Congress is not able to pass some of these things. So Represent Us is going to be fighting to pass these reforms in Congress. We are a state-focused organization in many ways, but when there are opportunities in DC with our partners across the spectrum, we want to get right to it. And right now, there's a huge, important opportunity to prevent these policies that will thwart authoritarianism should it come up again. Now we're going to quickly talk about prevent, which is what we've been focusing on for the past 8 years, and we're going to continue to in a long game. The question is, how do we prevent authoritarians from getting to power? But also the flip side of that is, how do we ensure that every American's voice and vote is heard, and that we translate votes into representation, that people feel represented and they feel the government works for them, even if it doesn't always work or there's compromises struck. There are 3 really big issues right now that matter. The first we're seeing right now is that our election system across administration, functioning, and even adjudication, meaning how do we resolve election disputes in the courts, is kind of broken. And there's clear fixes. Other advanced democracies don't do their elections in our ways. We need to pandemic proof our elections, whether it's the next COVID or virus or a natural disaster. We see opportunities in states where they already have pandemic proof their elections, and we just need to pass that everywhere. We need to amp up election security. We need to bring more trust across the spectrum in the fact that elections are administered by nonpartisan public servants, and that we could even make it so that nonpartisan judicial panels are the ones that are reviewing election disputes, not partisan courts. We also pass simple things like pre-canvassing that you probably heard about that are very wonky, but why aren't states like Pennsylvania allowed to just open up the envelopes and get ready to process mail ballots? That's problem this year of waiting for the results was created. It doesn't need to happen. And many states don't do this, and they had a great time on Tuesday with quick results and high voter turnout. The second is voting rights. I mean, Americans across the spectrum agree that all eligible citizens should have a secure and convenient opportunity to vote. It really does. Look at the polls. We can see State Voting Rights Act passed. Michigan passed one in 2018 that brought more election security, more automatic certification of registration, cleaner voter rolls, and more opportunities to vote, whether you want to vote early, by mail, in person, securely, in COVID, or in healthy times. We need a process that works for everybody. And the final really big one of these 3 is voter choice and proportional representation. Voters want more choice, that is clear. And in fact, even this year, the Libertarian candidate, Judge Jorgensen, it looks like may have been the spoiler for Donald Trump in a few key states, maybe even in some Senate races too. And this continues. It doesn't just hurt Democrats, it may hurt Republicans. And that's because voters consistently say in those Gallup polls year after year, they want more opportunities, they want more parties. And the key side of this, and this is a little on the edge, but I really believe it, listening to scholars talk about this, we need to fight polarization, but we also need to manage it. That means a lot. Polarization is in a lot of ways probably here to stay for a while. It's a lot of work to be done on social media and reforms there. But what does it mean to say polarization is natural and it's okay? We want to tamper it down, especially when it leads to violence. But we really also need to be able to manage it. We need to give people more choices past the 2 parties. We need to give them a situation where they feel that they can vote and their voice is heard and their interests are represented, without it being an all-out war between 2 parties every year. So I'm going to close asking the same questions. Could we get it passed? And the key takeaway here is, even if the federal opportunity that we thought may have materialized in just a few months is not coming true, there is always opportunity in the states. There are 50 states and they present opportunities every single year. Federal opportunities open up just once in a while, but we always have that opportunity. And that is why Represent Us was founded. A lot of our friends and allies across the spectrum focus in DC, and that's hugely important. And we work with a lot of partners in the states too. We have to fill all those gaps. So we're going to be fighting to keep passing these reforms. I'm excited to tell you, for example, on the election administration, we've already invested in 7 states to pass that gold standard model that's used not just in blue Colorado, but red Utah next door, where they give voters, whether you want to vote in person or by mail, a secure counting system with live streams and election judges. This is the 21st century. It is modern, it's secure, and it's actually 40% cheaper. And we can raise that number from 7 to 14 to 20 investments to pass these over the next 2 years. So then in time for the 2024 presidential primary, we are running a much cleaner, smoother, trustworthy system for the 2024 presidential. My final closing, and Janice is joining us here because we're about to move to Q&A, is just to remind everybody that this really is the long game. Federal opportunities were a big sweep of reform. They will open up. We're not sure when, and we're always going to be ready, and we really hope it's bipartisan. But the long game is won piece by piece in the state every year. You saw the reforms Josh just highlighted. We had a major year in 2018. COVID made 2020 tough, but 21 and 22 is going to be huge. We have so much to fix, and it can be done, but it is simply a matter of funding and scaling and dedication to staying in for the long game. So thanks for listening.
Thanks, Alex. And one thing before we go to you, Janice, folks, do ask questions on the Q&A button to the right on the bottom of your screen. And I just want to add one other thing, which is also, we will continue, not all has changed this year. We are going to do what we've always done, which is be opportunistic about where we can pass reforms, be it in the states or federally, but being open to, we've got an opportunity to pass open primaries in such and such a state, and we'll do it. Seeding a ranked choice voting campaign in that state, we'll do it. An anti-gerrymandering law in that state, we will do it. And automatic voter registration, vote by mail. This is key because we have to be able to hedge our opportunities, build strong local right-left coalitions, continue to be strictly nonpartisan. Because while we certainly have a bias given the Republican Party's opposition to many of these measures now, most Americans are not hardcore partisans. Most Americans are disgusted with the system. 40 some odd percent are registered independents, and we have to embrace everyone. Janice, to you.
All right, we're going to try to get to as many questions, and I want everyone to know we've also been taking questions by email. So if you have a question, please put it in the chat box. The first one is to you, Josh. After the results of this election, do you think we need to change how we do polling, or was this really COVID?
Yeah, well, we do need to change how we do polling, but I do think that, I've made no secret of my dislike of Donald Trump recently. He's acting like an authoritarian. He's anti-democracy, and he's racist. And I do think that there's a few different dynamics at play here, but in this particular person of Donald Trump in 2016 and 2020, as was really put very well in an opinion piece I saw in Politico today, the fact is that there's a lot of people who are so-called shy Trump voters who don't want to admit it, whether it's because they are, they're doing it because they know he's racist, but it kind of reflects their views. Racism plays a role. I think also his sort of garish character. They don't want to admit that they support him, but they really do. And I think that's just sort of a negative element of our society that exists and is reflected in these discrepancies that are particularly acute around a candidate or politician like Donald Trump.
Okay. Alex, this is for you. Does the losing president retain all powers until they leave in January? Transition.
A lame duck president? I believe so. I mean, there's a lot of atmospheric differences about what a lame duck president is essentially allowed to get away with, and Congress is not likely to be in session. We'll see what happens with COVID deals, but a lot of people have written concerningly about what Donald Trump might do in his final months, in addition to pardons for himself and his family and others, as well as frustrating an incoming Biden transition by making it hard to get access to documents. I do think we need to be alert for that. However, I'm not an expert on presidential powers and the lame duck, so I'm not going to speak authoritatively to it. Thanks.
Okay, well, stay on the line because we've taken a lot of this same question, and as the head of our campaigns and policy, can you speak to what happened in Massachusetts and ranked choice voting? Why did it lose? What happened?
Yeah, so for just 48 hours. It's a tough loss, everyone, but it was a close one. Here's what we think happened, and we're going to learn more. It was COVID. I mean, largely when you can't be out knocking doors, ranked choice voting is it's a double-sided coin. It's an enormously powerful incentive changing structural reform. And because it's enormously powerful and structural, it takes some time to explain. If you sit down, if you're into ranked choice voting, you probably know this. If not, I'll talk to you sometime about it. If you sit down for 30 seconds, 2 minutes, and can talk to someone about it, about if they've ever felt like they had to throw their vote away or vote for a spoiler or vote strategically, and you walk them through how it works, most people get to yes very quickly. When you can't have those conversations at the door, right? And an incredibly just crazy tough year of 2020, it's not that surprising that this campaign was on the margins. In addition, when it won in Maine just a few years ago, Maine has had a history of spoilers over and over again. Massachusetts doesn't have that history. That doesn't mean it was a bad idea to run the campaign. They were really proud of that campaign. What an incredible grassroots campaign and execution. But just remember, many movements, including same-sex marriage, lost some 37, 36 times before winning for the first time. This is the start of a movement, and a loss like this is not unlikely.
Only the beginning. And so, Josh, I know we are so proud of, and we are so fiercely nonpartisan, but I want you to answer this. We have someone who is a chapter co-lead, and he says he's been getting a lot of negative feedback from folks who feel that RepUs has become partisan, or we are now more democratic as an organization, so more left. And he would love just your thoughts on this. What do you think?
Yeah. Well, that could be easily misconstrued when the president, who happens to be a Republican, goes full authoritarian, totalitarian on us, which is what's happened in this country, right? We've had a president who has attacked the press. He has tried to stop voting. He's alleged that democracy and our voting systems are fraudulent when they're not. He has called on the jailing of his opponents. These are all trademark, hallmark authoritarian moves like you would see from authoritarians across the globe in years past. And when we called out Trump, we got a lot of this kind of like, oh my God, you're actually a Democrat. And that's the problem. We're in this two-party system where if you're against one person who happens to be a Republican in this case, then you must be on the other side. When in fact, the farthest thing is from the truth. This is an organization that is hell-bent on creating real competition in politics and creating real ethics and campaign finance laws. When we go into blue states and we try to move our agenda, if those blue states are well controlled by Democrats, they often quietly oppose us, and we fight them tooth and nail. The Republicans, if they control a state, they oppose us. Whoever has power opposes us. And so the proof is in the pudding, in that you are going to continue, because we've done it many times before, you are going to continue to see us in states pushing for things like ranked choice voting or open primaries against the will of both parties, and we will not back down.
Great answer. All right, this is for either one of you. What needs to be done to remove the Electoral College so the popular votes determine our elected officials? Or else change the system so that the percent of votes claimed within a state go to a specific candidate rather than the winner-take-all system that we currently have?
Alex?
Yeah, thankfully, there are a lot of options, legal and political options. There's, as someone just said in the chat, there's the Interstate Compact, which a number of states have signed on to. And if enough states sign on to it, it will take effect and we will have a national popular vote. There are new proposals every day. There's also the simple change that battleground states or any state could adopt by state legislative action the decision to award their electoral votes to whoever wins the national popular vote. What gets me excited about this is that still Americans across the spectrum, Republicans, Democrats, and independents, believe the national popular vote. And what I saw this year a lot in 2020 were people writing postcards, right? I live in Pennsylvania. So people writing postcards from states where their votes literally didn't matter, into Pennsylvania, into my household, my friend's household, my wife's aunt's household, saying, please vote because you're the vote that matters. I think people are both sick of the bombardment of political ads in PA and Michigan, in the 8 states that matter, and it's just 20% of the population. There is a way that we can change this with the national popular vote so that every vote matters. It changes how people will campaign. We'll see campaign stops everywhere. We'll see presidential candidates appealing to all types of Americans across our beautiful, huge country. And I believe that that is a goal that we can capture inside of the next decade.
And it's also worth noting, guys, that getting this issue advanced is something that we have passively, secondarily supported historically, and it's very likely coming out of this election that this will be among the top priorities for Represent Us in the future.
Excited to hear that. Josh, what are we doing about preventing huge money effectively buying judges or justice seats?
It's a good question. This issue of money in politics has been stalled for a while now. There was a period of time, if you go all the way back to 1974 in the wake of Watergate, that was the last time this country has seen truly game-changing campaign finance reforms. McCain-Feingold passed, but was kind of riddled with loopholes and sort of unintended and intended consequences that sort of defanged it to a significant degree. There was a lot of false starts in the advocacy community over decades on campaign finance reform and a lot of losses. And it's for that reason that we've been very careful not to get into this space, into campaign finance reform, be it for judges or for politicians, without a very clear path to victory, because we are not willing to waste time and money on this issue, even though it's incredibly important. One of the things we're going to be doing over the next few months is really trying to refocus on figuring out a solution, because the fact is that this election was nearly twice as expensive as the last presidential election, and that one blew all of the records away. So we are talking about billions and billions and billions of dollars now, whereas just a few years ago it was a big deal that the federal elections broke $1 billion. So this is a completely out of control problem with, unfortunately, no clear and easy solutions, but it's something we're going to be doubling down on.
I'd like for either one of you to make a comment on the increasing concerns about voter fraud and resulting lawsuits, because we are almost out of time.
Go ahead.
Well, look, there's always been allegations of voter fraud, and they continue to tick up in the age of social media because people are understandably worried. I mean, elections are sacred. But the reality is, as you know, over and over again, it's not just the research institutions, nonpartisan think tanks, it's the FBI that has told us that voter fraud is essentially non-existent. It's down to the levels and the numbers that you can count on your fingers. And those people get caught and go to jail. Just like the person who tried to register to vote twice just this year to test the system, and he's in jail now. But it is understandable. We have to respond to people's concerns by voter fraud by doing what I said earlier, which is update and modernize and secure our election systems in a way that they can trust, that they can see, that they can visit, and they can touch, and they can understand. And that's huge, and there's a huge, beautiful opportunity to do that. I also believe that largely we're seeing the Trump campaign push voter fraud narrative. It's a way to decrease trust. And we always have to speak, whether it's to our family members, our loved ones, friends, or people we barely meet, when they say voter fraud is happening, to push them to look for proof, look to sources like the FBI, nonpartisan sources, to validate it, because it will get validated if it's true, but it certainly isn't.
That's great. All right, last question for you, Josh. Is it your perception that the Republican Party is still the party of Lincoln, or is it really now Trump's party? That's a tough one.
I think time will tell. If Trump wins today or this week, it'll be the party of Trump. If it's not, I think it's an interesting fact that the Republicans managed to win quite a few Latino votes, a lot more Latino votes, especially in places like the Cuban vote in Southeast Florida. And there's going to be a reckoning that's going to happen in the party, which is that, are they going to embrace diversity and democracy as their existential path forward, or are they going to continue to try to foreclose participation and block out participation in order to protect a sort of a minority? And time will tell. I don't know. One thing I will say, excuse me, we've intentionally not done a big show and tell of all the things we've done this year, of which there's been many, especially lately. I will mention that just to assuage your concerns about the security of this election and this playing out in a sane manner, at 3:00 today, we will have George Casey, former general, Steve Abbott, former admiral, the former secretary of the Army, and other major military people on a press call for the Count Every Hero program, calling for the vote to be counted and respected, particularly because it's disproportionately military men and women who vote and whose ballots are received after Election Day now, while the Trump campaign is trying to stop counting. So efforts continue apace. I don't know what's going to happen with the Republican Party, but I just want to reiterate what Janice is about to say, which is just deep gratitude to everybody who's tuned in today, who supports our work, and looking forward to continuing that work next year.
Alex.
Yeah, I want to echo that too. And I just want to say, if you were frustrated or surprised or let down or excited by the way this roller coaster of an election went, there will be more of them. And the way we can fix that and the way we can center our government so it works for people and their families again is this nonpartisan structural movement. And that's what excites me the most about this next decade, what we can accomplish next year, what we can accomplish in the long game, because I don't want to keep going through this every 4 years. I'm sure you don't either. I see a lot of great conversation in the chat, but this is the movement. And if you're here because you're new, then stay with us, bring more people in. If you're here because you're obsessed like we are, we're really grateful for you, and bring more folks in as well.
All right, folks, we are out of time. I want to thank you all for joining us. And I especially want to give a shout out to all of our board members who are here with us, founding families, our Commonwealth, our volunteers. Thank you. I feel so lucky to be here with all of you and have a front seat to this historic moment. More people participated in our elections than ever before. Voting is our fundamental right and the cornerstone of our democracy, to have a voice and a seat at the table. I leave you all with this quote from Nelson Mandela, who fought apartheid and became president of South Africa and then a Nobel Peace Prize winner. It always seems impossible until it's done. Thank you.